Alright, so before we get into a movie from this year, I thought we should go back a few years to 2016 because there was a movie that a lot of people went totally crazy for, and pretty much everybody and their mother has seen and talked about over the past few years that I just never really got around to until now. And despite given its popularity and how much people love it, that's kind of weird. But if I had to guess, I would say what would happen is I don't know that I remembered hearing about it in 2016 or hearing very little about it. And since we kind of do the constant reviews thing since, 7 years ago, it's kind of become a whole thing of we're in one year and then we go through all those movies, and then once we move on to the next year, it's like, why bother going back because we hit just about everything. So when I caught wind that a movie from 2016 was really big that I missed, I guess we were just stuck in the other years, and I just kind of never went back to it. But now that I have, I kind of see what exactly I was missing, and felt I needed to be prepared before going into Peninsula, so there was that also. So before that, let's go into Train to Busan, even though, like I was saying, I don't know what I could possibly say that hasn't been said already at this point. But because the only thing I really heard specifically before going into it was that everybody loved it, pretty much. So and that it kind of had 28 Days Later vibes as far as if you were going to compare it to another zombie movie or franchise or whatever. Yeah, and I do get that vibe, and there's kind of a World War Z vibe the way they kind of topple all over each other. But going into this, I think the first really good sign was pretty much every time you run into a cliche, it's a cliche that's being done right. Like when you look at the characters we're first introduced to, or the major characters, which would be this sort of business dad sort of stereotype who's been way too busy, and he's, separated from the mom, and the daughter would rather be with the mom because he's just constantly at work, and he has no family focus whatsoever. He barely has time at work to have his Burger King lunch that's just been thrown together. He gets her a gift that he already got her the year before. He's just that kind of dad, which is a cliche that we've seen over and over and over and over and over again in all different kinds of movies and genres. That trope has been everywhere. But what's interesting about it in this particular case is how real it feels. Because it's interesting how you can see a cliche so many times through so many different movies that you just kind of grow immune to it, and it loses any kind of impact that would have provoked it to become a trope that everybody wants to use. But when you see it when it actually feels like they're actual real people, like they're an actual father and daughter, then the fact that it is a cliche rarely even comes into your mind, if at all. Because you're just immediately grabbed by this sort of subtle emotion in it, because especially the moment when she opens the present and realizes it's what she got last year from him, her disappointment is so downplayed, that it actually gives it a really sort of realistic quality, and not just hey, we're establishing the characters and this is how they feel and that's the only reason the scene is here usually. But the fact setting up a realistic relationship and a strong relationship between the two of them is going to be the driving force through this whole movie, despite the kind of movie that it is, in kind of a really unexpected way. So there is that, and something I forgot to note was apparently there's also an animated prequel that I have not seen, but this definitely gives me motivation to check that out also. So once we've established those characters, we do get to the sort of main setting, which would be the train when they're going to see her mom, which I think they said is 280 miles is how far they have to go, which is only like an hour. So obviously, despite the movie being nearly 2 hours, you already kind of get a sense that it's probably going to be really, really fast-paced, and that's pretty much the case. It's interesting how there's so much character in this movie, in this zombie movie, yet it feels like it's nonstop as far as like action goes and like I guess the horror portion of it goes. Um, but I think it's the way they build up to how this takes off that really makes the difference. The way it's sort of not necessarily like a Shaun of the Dead thing where it goes on for a while before they realize what's happening, but just that shot, that really quick moment where there's like a very small window of time before shit really goes down, where the daughter's the only one that notices what's happening. When she looks out the window and sees the dude like tackled by the zombie, and she's like the only one that sees it. And then that builds to the girl that has got herself on the train barely, that's already been bit, and when she goes to the bathroom, and there's this whole thing where it's like, we don't even know where this character came from. She just runs onto the train, and we know what the problem is because she's been bit. And yet, in this one little moment where she's in the bathroom, is weirdly enough time to like invest, to where we actually get a sense that this is like we like immediately feel sympathy for her because we recognize the problem from other movies or stories, where we know that this is going to happen very quickly and she has to do something about it. But by the time we actually get invested in this character, we don't know. I don't think we've even heard her speak at this point. She turns in this very memorable shot of her being like next to the attendant or whatever she is, and how she just kind of rises from behind her, and then pretty much from that moment on, it feels pretty much nonstop. And the way, and I think what else makes that that first transformation really work, and like the initial attack, is that while the score does end up playing a big part in this, the fact that they don't immediately go for like the big music when they really could. How the whole score is kind of downplayed as it really starts to take off, because and it puts like the main focus on the action and what actually is happening rather than the score trying to make it sound super dramatic. It just kind of is super dramatic in its own way without any help, which is really great. And the fact that it's so the way they turn into a horde happens so quickly, and it's like in the way they're referred to as rabid, just really sets the scene very very quickly. And then that's the thing also is that we've gotten to know a handful of characters before this goes on, but like I said, it's really the character work that makes this so strong, because they do manage to show off, different ways where the action's not always front and center, but still has cool moments. Like when they're watching the stuff like through videos on social media, and we see like the whole helicopter thing go down and all that stuff, and then the way the action sequences happen. But a lot of this wouldn't have the weight that it does if they didn't really do the character work that they do. But the great thing about it is, unlike other zombie movies or stories or whatever, you're not like it's all happening so quickly and you're getting invested so quickly. You're not really conscious of the fact of, oh, this is how we, this is the part where we focus on the characters, so that it like usually when you watch it, it almost feels like you're watching an equation, where it's like, well, this has to happen and be said so that you can feel this when this happens, and you can calculate it as you watch it, and I mean, in certain stories it can be there if it's strong enough, but you still see all the wheels turning. But this one just kind of pulls you into it to the point that you're just kind of blind to all that, and it just feels like you're watching it in like real time. The relationships and the horror and terror of all of it, which is amazing. And especially the way they bring in like clever ways of finding ways to control them, where it's like where they discover the zombies' weaknesses like by accident, but not in like a convoluted way, but just like in the natural series of events. It occurs to them like, oh well, if they don't see us, they don't think we're there, and oh, if when we go through the tunnels, they can't see in the dark, so they just pause. And it's stuff like that that just comes along so naturally and kind of solves problems to an extent, is really clever writing and kind of setup just in general. But like I was saying, as far as the characters go, it's like I said, it's really the emotion that's kind of the star of this movie, weirdly, where a lot of it is family based, because of the handful of characters we meet, we do have the father and daughter, and of course that connection is established. But then we've got, like, the two older women that are sisters, and you've got the family that's the husband and the pregnant wife, and it's like that whole sort of familial thing is such a common theme throughout it, and the way that kind of goes into how much one is like willing to sacrifice themselves or not, whether it be for family or otherwise, and just kind of that balance between, like, the selfish and the selfless, and how that kind of pretty much determines your outcome as far as which one of those that you are. Because while we do have a lot of characters here that are incredibly sympathetic, we've also got a bit of, I don't know that he quite falls into the antagonist category, despite how much he fucks shit up with some of the decisions he makes. But we do have, like, the COO guy, the douchey business guy, who kind of, when you look at the sort of business dad trope that the main character is going through, it's sort of like this douchey business guy is sort of like his ghost of, Christmas Future or something. I don't know if that's intentionally what they were going for, but that's kind of the vibe I got. And obviously the different paths they end up going down in regards to the decisions they make and for what reasons they make those decisions, whether they be selfish or selfless, depends entirely on the character. And it's really great at shaping and fleshing out the characters in regards to the decisions they make. But what's also interesting about that is when you talk about how there was a whole bunch of people on this plane, and then the horde happened so quickly that it's only kind of the handful we kind of got to know are the only ones left. Because there's also the dude and that girl that he, like, has a crush on. But there's also the whole idea of all those characters that we didn't get to know. And it's like the movie is so strong with its character work. Instead of those just being faceless people that eventually turn into zombies like they would be in another story, there's so much emotion and character work in this that it makes you start to wonder about those people that we never really did meet. When it's like, well, if this character's going through this and this character's going through this, who knows what one of these random zombies that we never met was going through before this happened. And it's not common that you think that about characters that are just in the background. But I feel like this movie did that pretty well, with especially how character focused it is. And that's the thing too, is it's like there is a lot of cases here where we do have, a lot of standout action scenes. There's a lot of, intense chases and destruction. There's a very poorly timed glass bridge that's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there's, like, close call after close call and stuff like that. There's so much of that, which is a huge strength of these movies, especially when they're done right. But there's also, even so, there will be moments where you kind of recognize as we've sort of been here, in this kind of material or in this kind of scene or whatever. But the situations and the outcomes, like, the events lead so perfectly to those moments that it all just sort of, like I said, adds up in a way to where it's all, the writing is sort of basically an equation, but like I said, an invisible one, as opposed to in other zombie movies where you can just kind of see it all coming together. Where it's like, even if you can see where this one's going, there's always some sort of, like, tiny little twist they put on it that makes it feel fresh, or different in its own way. There's even talking about the whole family theme. There's even a moment at the very end of Douchey Business Guy where he's got his own sort of motivation that we never knew until, like, right up to the very last minute. That could potentially, reshape his character on, like, if you revisit the movie, I'm guessing. But I know it still comes from, it was certainly a comeuppance for him as well. But that's the kind of thing, is to have that sort of conflicting thing with characters like that, especially one that you have such a definitive feeling towards through most of the movie, is really impressive. So, yeah, with all that in mind, I can totally see how this managed to sort of break out in a way. And like I said, it does feel kind of a shame that I didn't get around to it till, like, now. But I am glad that I did, and I can definitely see where that hype is coming from. But, as I've said, I don't really know what I could possibly be saying that people haven't already heard. In the last 4 years, this has been out and very popular. So, that's how I feel about that. Going into Peninsula, which we start off in kind of the same area, and then we jump ahead 4 years. We literally do the 28 Days Later thing, where it's I think 4 years later is even the tagline on the movie's poster. So, while it's not necessarily appears to be like a direct sequel, like I've heard the term spin-off kind of thrown around, but it really just mainly we're in the aftermath of the events that happened in the first one. So there is that. I don't believe there's any. I didn't recognize any returning characters. I think it's all like a completely new batch of characters, completely new story. Just happens to be in the same universe. So going into this, there's definitely. I mean, you could really, because this movie's kind of two things. Because when you look at a movie, for argument's sake, we're just gonna call it a sequel. When you look at a sequel, there's going to be that whole thing where you are constantly comparing it to the other one, but there's also the case of you don't want it to be like the exact same thing. So it's really fun when filmmakers will take something and make a sequel and take it in like a totally sort of different direction, or like because usually when you do sequels, also it's a case of, okay, now that we've made a successful movie, we need to do a second one and go bigger, like the same thing but bigger. And this one's kind of doing both of those things, where it's trying to do something that's totally different from the first one, but it's also a case of they seem desperate to make everything bigger as possible, and that's not always the route you want to go. Like, you've got obviously stuff like T2 was the same thing but massively bigger. The Raid 2 was massively bigger. Aliens was massively bigger. With the exception of Aliens, those were also, Cameron did both the smaller Terminator versus the gigantic Terminator 2, and Gareth Evans did the Raid and the monumentally bigger the Raid 2. With this, while we also have the same filmmaker, it still, when you look at those other movies, you can still get a sense that even though they're bigger and almost their own thing by themselves, they're like on the same page. And I don't know about like complete, like I said, it's great when you want to do something totally different, despite kind of remaining in the same area. But there's cases where you don't want to jump too far off the page, because then it just gets weird and kind of jumbled and messy, and it's kind of hard to tell what exactly you were going for at the end of the day. Like, there's a lot of stuff here where you can say, like, this by itself is a great idea, and that by itself is a great idea. But the fact that they're in the same movie is weirding me out. I don't know how to take this. This doesn't quite add up. Because there's also, while there was such a natural thing going on about the first movie and the way the events occurred, like how from one scene to the next, it just seemed like that's the direction it naturally went. It didn't feel like a script was at work or somebody was trying to be clever. It just kind of was what it was and managed to find its way perfectly. This one, weirdly enough, is struggling with this whole thing of, it feels like it's trying very hard to be cool, which is the farthest thing I got from the first one. But yeah, they were definitely trying to take the go as big as possible thing here, like in the sense of almost creating an entirely different world. Because we are 4 years later after something so cataclysmic happened, it does make sense that we're kind of in this sort of post-apocalypse kind of thing. But the problem is that a lot of it, as far as like, the sets and all the other stuff, feels like typical post-apocalypse stuff, like Mad Max kind of stuff. It doesn't feel entirely fresh in that regard, which sucks, since that's pretty much the main direction like the whole middle portion takes. Because we do have a pretty promising story. We've got the prologue is really promising, kind of sets up the lead character in an interesting way, and kind of makes him a bit of a conflicted character. And then we've got these, big, great shots of, what everything has become up to this point. And there's a shot with a boat that's, like, really vast and grand and all that. That's great. But then it just kind of it dies down pretty quickly when it gets into familiar territory, and that's the thing where we were just talking about when the first movie went into familiar territory. There was always it always had that way of like making it feel more almost real and grounded, despite the kind of movie that it is. Um, but also had like a little kind of fresh twist on it. It felt like even if it was like at the last minute, um, or like the last moments of the scene, and it was. But I didn't really get a sense of those here, and when the I guess some are trying to go for that, but once again, that falls more into the category of it was them trying to say, okay, we can do this, but let's go really big with it, and then it turns into I don't know what the fuck. It's a chase movie for a large, what feels like a large portion of it, but not in the sense of people running away from zombies, but more like really over elaborate like Fast and Furious car chases. It's I don't know the tone is all over the damn place. I don't know. Um, but there's also the whole thing of the characters not being nearly as fleshed out. Like that's the kind of the first thing you notice because the emotion and the humanity was such a center thing in the first movie. And this one is much more about how grand can we get the sets and the action and all that other stuff. Um, like gunfights and explosions too are like all over the place. Because the human villains are much more of a focus in this one, and that's kind of the case where like you look at the Christopher Eccleston character in 28 Days Later and how it was like it felt unexpected in 28 Days Later because it was like a whole third act thing where it's like we think the whole idea is zombies are what we have to worry about, and then it's almost like a twist in 28 Days Later. Oh no, these dudes are just as threatening, if not more so, because they know what they're doing and can calculate and all that stuff. This is like kind of that whole approach where there's villains like constantly, and there's a lot of them. Uh, and it's I don't know, and the whole thing also is they take and this might sound like an interesting idea, but there's just so much going on already. It's almost like they set up a plot, and then that plot takes a backseat for all the other shit that's going on. Where it's like what would make it interesting on paper is the fact that in most classic zombie movies, there's always the big suspenseful scene of get to the vehicle. And this whole, like, they set up a whole plot that is get to the vehicle. It just so happens that this vehicle is a truck that has $20 million in it, and they have to get it from one place to they have to go get it and then get it from one place to the next. So it's like to take sort of an old thing from old zombie movies about the whole we've got to go from here and get to a vehicle before we get attacked by zombies and make that like the whole story is interesting. But then you've got all this other stuff going on that's really just distracting more than anything else. They do go, like I mentioned Mad Max in passing just because Mad Max is usually the first thing you reference when you talk about post-apocalypse movies. No, there's like a whole, Thunderdome kind of thing going on. There's like a whole gladiator arena, where this so much of this movie is stuff where you can just tell it must have looked amazing written down as like an outline. Like the movie's gonna have this and the movie's gonna have this. And I can imagine somebody thinking like this is going to be the best movie ever with all this stuff in it. But when you actually see them try to mesh it all together, it's like you never really quite know where you are. So, or maybe that's just me, I don't know. But I kind of felt like it was a bit all over the place. And because of that, it kind of makes the whole middle portion pretty forgettable. Like, look, you're not really going to remember the characters, and you're not really going to remember much of the action outside of maybe the whole arena thing. But apart from that, it's just all kind of trying to find whatever the hell it's going to do next in the middle without seemingly having a clear idea. So there's that. And like I said, it really is missing the emotion from the first movie. Because the thing also is, like, because there's so many characters in this, and the thing about the first one was that the number of characters was constantly decreasing. But the thing about that was that the movie had so much humanity, and it's like you would think it would lose that the more you lose characters, the more the characters get picked off, but it's like, no, because, you know, the characters really had something to live for, or somebody to live for, that, like, the more, and the way they were being affected and seeing, you know, what happens, the more you were cutting characters out of the first movie, the more it amplified the humanity in it. And that's just almost missing entirely from this one. I mean, there's characters that are likable, but there's the, you know, the 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 woman and the two kids and that whole family, and you know, some of the villains have like a scene or two where you like almost kind of like them, at least in a charismatic way, every now and then. But for the most part, they all just kind of, the characters just kind of blend together, and it's all it's all just a blur, just kind of the whole middle. And there is, but the interesting thing about that though is when I say how character driven the first one is and how this one isn't, the fact that it does have so many characters, but it's like it's so like there is such a thing as being too human focused. And I don't mean like focusing on the motivations or the emotions of the characters, I just mean focusing on the human characters in general. Like, there's so much focus on our main sort of group here, and then there's the villain group and all those people, and there's a lot of focus on that. And it's like every now and then it might sometimes forget that it's even a zombie movie. And I know that that has been praised in previous things where there's so much human emotion, it's like the zombies are almost secondary. But this isn't like that. This isn't one of those. And even if it was, that whole kind of thing is still so played out to this point. I still blame The Walking Dead for ruining it, but but yeah, that's so yeah, there is such a thing as being too human focused. But if you are going to be that human focused, you need to do it in the right way. And this doesn't really find that sort of emotional layer that the other one did. So there is that. But like I said, this is all really just leading to a big giant chase scene at the end. It feels like it goes on for a fucking eternity. And like I said, with every like couple of minutes in this chase, you could just tell they were off screen saying like, you know, go bigger, go bigger, go bigger, go bigger. And it's like that just like every now and then something like T2 or Aliens or the Raid 2, yes, by all means, go bigger and bigger and bigger. As long as you're in control and you have a plan, by all means, you know, go bigger. If you're a James Cameron or a Gareth Evans or whatever, do it. But this approach just didn't really seem to work for this. But I am really behind the ambition and the ideas for sure, and the idea of going so far different than what the other one was, where like while the first one was about really, you know, the claustrophobia of just being in the train, despite occasionally being like in the stations and all that, this one's just as big and wide as the sets can get. And I totally get that, but I don't think that it worked to its fullest potential by far. So yeah, that's how I feel about that. So I think that's pretty much going to be it for these. The next thing is going to be a versus, probably. There's one of two verses it's going to be, but there's going to be about three verses, and then we're going to review Sandler's movie, and then it'll be another Stephen King novella. So, and we'll just continue this pretty much throughout the whole month, and then God knows what's going to happen in November. We'll figure it out. So until all that, I think that's it for this.